We spent 13 hours fighting for our lives. If we were not rescued in a matter of hours, we would die a very different kind of death. There's a moment when I was hanging on this rope ladder, fighting for dear life. It felt that I had lost essentially the two most important people in my life. It almost seems easier just to let go and just to usher in the end. It's funny when these kind of life death situation, there's always a comical moment, that takes you out of the feeling. I'm actually content with the amount of experiences and journeys and tribulations and trials that I've went through. And now it's the giving back time. Now it's about really coming to terms with what is it that I've learned.
Welcome aboard EMIT Talks. On this episode, we dive deep and climb high into the life and mind of the enigmatic Omar Samra, renowned adventurer, entrepreneur, author, and speaker. The first Egyptian to scale Mount Everest, the 7 summits, and complete the Explorer's Grand Slam. A true adventurer with a human heart, Samra has embarked on a lifetime of incredible achievements, from his mountaineering exploits to launching the Middle East's first carbon-neutral adventure travel company, to attempting a perilous 3,000-mile rowing journey across the Atlantic. We'll be attempting to ascend to his levels of peak performance and mental toughness. Join us as we take a step-by-step trek through the mind of one of the most accomplished and still inspiringly accomplishing individuals of his generation, Omar Samra, only on EMIT Talks.
Welcome aboard EMIT Talks, right here, shot aboard an EMIT Boat. And we are with none other than adventurer, entrepreneur, speaker, author, and much, much, much more, Omar Samra. Omar, welcome aboard EMIT Talks.
Sophie, lovely to be here. Always good to hang out, Yani, this time with a mic, but looking forward.
Absolutely. We go way back, and we'll talk about how way back we go. But first, and as always on EMIT Talks, we always start by believing that success never comes without failures. Mm-hmm. So we straight up, out of the bat, ask you, Omar Samra's favorite failures in life, your favorite failures.
I've had some epic ones, Yani, since we're on the water, the first one that came to mind is the Beyond the Raging Sea episode, which was 2017, when somehow I had this idea that it was a good idea to to take a rowing boat and try and row across the Atlantic with my buddy Omar Noor,
who also has no rowing experience,
which also had no rowing experience. But yani, contrary to popular belief, we did spend about 2 years learning the ropes and training our ass off. But yani, basically nothing went to plan. Yani, on that day, it was the boat capsized in 45 knot wind, sort of Atlantic storm. We spent 13 hours fighting for our lives, and eventually we got rescued. But yani, it was a failure of epic proportions, because the goal was to get from the Canary Islands to Antigua. We didn't succeed in that. But there was another goal of this expedition, which was that we wanted to use this very extraordinary adventure where we're going to be at sea in a very fragile boat to shed light on the plight of refugees. At the time, it still happens to this day. Displacement is a huge issue. However, it was very much frontline news at the time, especially across the Mediterranean. And so we wanted to shed light on this. And so we thought, 2 men rowing across the Atlantic is a perfect analogy for this. We didn't know how far we would take this analogy, and that we would find ourselves, even just for a few hours, in almost the similar situation to the people that we were trying to raise awareness for. Of course, we got to learn through this experience that yani, it's chalk and cheese, yani, the comparison between us. Yani, we did this by choice. We had the best training, the best equipment, and so in some sense, you can say that the primary goal of the expedition failed. And so it is kind of a failure in the sense of what you're asking about. But there's always a way to flip the narrative and to say, well, actually, in some ways, it was a giant success. We decided not to try again and not to go back. We gave ourselves a year to decide whether, because there's a lot of pressure that we should go back, and the hero story is to fail and then come back and triumph. So we decided that we weren't going to do that. We gave ourselves a year, so we really settled down, and we were like, you know what, the pull to try and do it was no longer there. But what it did was it gave us a platform, a story, that we then sort of started, speaking out loud and traveling the world and raising awareness about this issue. So in some sense, you can say it was its own kind of success. And I think it applies to any story. When you encounter failure of some kinds, immediately in the short term, it feels like it's the worst thing in the world. But eventually, give it enough time, and you will credit this failure for something else positive that will happen later on.
I mean, you say it feels like the worst thing at the time, and you do delve deeper into that in the actual film, which is on Netflix, Beyond the Raging Sea. But I am still curious until this day. You were in the water with another Omar in a boat that was supposed to never capsize in the middle of the Atlantic in raging seas. How did that feel? And what was going through your mind? This was hours and hours and hours. So that was probably processes of thoughts. What was that like?
It was supposed to capsize, but it was supposed to self-right. It was never supposed to not self-right, and it had been tested. So Omar and I had very different experiences, debriefing, and now obviously that many years have passed and so on. Omar's first thought was not like this, because he legit thought khalas, this was it, we were gonna die. For me, I got into this immediately. I cared very little in the moment of the journey itself, even though there was a huge build-up. The fact that it looked very clearly that we weren't going to get to the other side, and I started to get very laser focused onto our own survival. And it was only 13 hours later, at the very sort of like climax of this story, at the very kind of defining moment, that I started to think deeply about my family, and specifically my daughter. And I remember having a flash, seeing my daughter. She was I think she was like 6. She would have been 4 years old at the time. And I think that gave me the extra strength, the last bit that I needed in order to actually like fight for surviving. There's a moment when I was hanging on this rope ladder, like, fighting for dear life, that it crosses your mind. It's like a split second, and you're like, you know what? It almost seems easier just to let go and just, and just to usher in the end.
So it was an image of your daughter that made you not let go at that time.
Yeah. And it just came rushing in, and for the 13 hours, I was, it's not like my family didn't cross my mind, but I was, for the very most part, I was just really focused on survival. And so the feelings obviously was a lot of adrenaline, like pumping through your body, like which is amazing, because we'd been on the boat for about 9 days, taking 2-hour shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, no sleep. You sleep 40 minutes interrupted every 4 hours. So the body had taken a big hit. There was a huge toll on our bodies. We weren't eating very much food, seasickness, all the rest of it. So we needed that adrenaline to be able to function.
And speaking of food and drink, what were you guys doing stuck with a capsized boat for 13 hours? Did you have any rations to eat? Was there any water around
you? So when you eventually we managed to we attempted to inflate the life raft. The problem was that not only did we capsize and the boat didn't self-right, but the life raft didn't inflate. Eventually, 4 or 5 hours in, we managed to manually inflate the raft. Inside the raft, there is a little bag with very, very limited rations. We're talking like 750 mils of water and like a pack of biscuits. But you're staring at a 7.5 meter rowboat that's fully upturned, that has about 1.5 months worth of food, but you can't touch it. Khalas, it's fully upturned, and there's no way to access the hatches or anything. And so it was a pretty grim reality that if we were not rescued in a matter of hours, or we would die a very different kind of death. Yeah.
And the irony, as far as I understand, and you mentioned earlier, you undertook this to highlight the displacement of a lot of refugees and a lot of people around the world, and you yourself ended up being displaced. The irony, and if I remember correctly, the captain of the boat that finally found you ended up also being Egyptian.
Yeah, it was wild.
And then the story of you being displaced, be it in your return journey, and then the reaction when you got home. That was also a wild part of the story for me.
Yeah, so basically, like, when you're going from Canary Islands to Antigua, you're traveling. You have to take your passport with you. So obviously, all my passports sunk with the boat, and so when we were rescued, we were eventually taken by the Spanish Coast Guard, and we were sent to the Canary Islands. From there, we were able to get sort of emergency papers to get to Madrid, and from there we had to go to the embassy. So I went to the Egyptian embassy. I'm a dual national, so I had the option of going to one of both. Obviously I had
chose the Egyptian embassy.
Chose the Egyptian embassy.
Walked in and said, "Hey, I just capsized in the Atlantic, and my passport's in the bottom of the ocean."
Exactly. Fortunately, like, there was already some news, some publicity around the journey, so it was a very unbelievable story in the outset, but it didn't take very much digging to realize, okay, these guys are at least me, Omar had different route. And I got an emergency passport and went to Cairo. The idea was then to get my passport and then renew my other passport and so on. And I get to Cairo airport. I showed the little piece of paper, and I had told the embassy, please, can you please, inform someone, because my story is not that believable. If somebody doesn't really know me, it's going to be very hard to convince anyone of the validity of this story. And we were taken to the side, and then it was Terminal 3, and you have the windows of the passport control, and then to the right there is this I can only call it paravon.
Yeah.
And then there's a corridor behind it and a door. Everybody knows that there's this thing, and then there's this door, but very little people know what's behind this door. So I was ushered into behind this door, and then there's a reception desk. And then from there, they took my phone, and I was put into a room where I spent about 6 hours with people who, are getting deported, people that are for legitimate or illegitimate reasons.
So you were detained, pretty much.
I was detained. Yeah, I was detained, and I had imagined this sort of hero's welcome. This guy who survived like the elements and so on. And so I had my mother, my father, like my brother, my daughter, like the driver, like there's so many people that were waiting for me, like to come out.
And at the time, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you were an established name in Egypt. You were established as, potentially one of the biggest adventurers in Egyptian history, having been the first to climb Everest. So you weren't an unknown to them.
Yeah, I think Egypt has its own special way of humbling you, and so. I lost access to my phone. I said, can I call, and they said, like, you don't have any documentation. Like I said, I have an ID, I don't have it with me, but if you just give me a chance, my father's just waiting outside of the airport. I can, someone can let him in or take some stuff with him to confirm identity.
And speaking of out of the airport, if I remember correctly, around that time, there were billboards of you outside the airport as well.
Yeah. So it was wild, and it's the only time when you want someone to recognize you, just it never happens. All my stories kind of seemed very unbelievable, and I was detained, and it was like one of those situations where if you wanted to go to the bathroom, you had to ask someone, and someone had to be standing behind you while you're taking a piss. I'm just a guy who just arrived. There was no need to assume the worst, but so over time. It was getting late, so my mother went home, and then a little bit longer, then my father went home, and then I think I in the end I think they had to run some security checks, and eventually they let me out. But at that time it was like 4:00 in the morning.
I mean, to be fair, the story is weird.
Yeah.
You know, you're coming in without a passport, and the
And
excuses.
it went from like, getting out, and then there's like a roaring applause and the family about waiting for you and hugs and kisses to me getting out and the driver's already asleep in the car and I'm like knocking on the on the window.
Alas, you're out finally.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious. When the boat captain that discovered you figured out that he just rescued two random Egyptians, what was his reaction?
I mean, his first thought, he didn't know they were Egyptian first. He just thought there was two random people in a small boat, and they were like, these guys are, they're trying to cross the Atlantic, like in a kind of an illegitimate way, which he must have thought these are like they must be crazies, because you can try to cross the Mediterranean, and trying to cross the Atlantic this way is a bit of a stretch. He did find out we were Egyptian in a very funny way, because the process of getting us picked up, it took a few hours, because every time the ship comes and fails to pick us up for whatever reason, for a ship of this size, we're talking about 200-meter, 35,000 ton like bulk carrier.
And this is mid-Atlantic. This is not the calm Red Sea waters.
And this was already like 8-10 meter waves, like it was a massive storm. It takes it about half an hour to reorient itself and come back. So by the time it had done 7 or 8 passes, like 3-4 hours had already passed. In one of the passes, we get very close. We can see there's people on the deck, but it's the wind and everything is so hard to communicate. So eventually we get close enough, because we started to hear, sometimes when we were downwind, we started to hear their voices. And initially we thought because the boat's called the Kefalonia, and the people looked Mediterranean, so we thought they're Greek. Eventually we started to hear Arabic. To be honest, I wanted to hear Norwegian, German, something.
Swiss.
Something that, inspires a bit more confidence that we would get out of this alive. But then there was 2 guys that were running frantically on the deck, holding this big barrel, and we couldn't understand what they were running frantically trying to think. And then eventually one guy was like kind of stuck, not knowing how to figure out what to do, and then all of a sudden this guy shouts out to him, and in like a perfect Egyptian accent goes, "Ya ibni, shil al-ghata." And he was trying to deploy this thing without removing the lid, and what it was this like super long 200-meter coiled rope. You press a button and it just flies. But anyway, they missed. They fired it in the wrong direction, so we couldn't catch the rope. And then we were like, okay, they're not even just Arabs, they're kind of Egyptian. But we were there on the next turn, we knew they were Egyptian. So we were looking at them and we're like, "Entum Masriyin," and they're like, "Ah," and then they're like, "Entum Masriyin," and then we're like, "Ah," and then like, "Entum bta'melu ايه هنا?" and we're like, "Mish waqto." But it was like, it's funny when these kind of life death situation, there's always like a comical moment, that like takes you out of the feeling.
I mean, that sounds like the adventure of a lifetime. But in Omar's world, that's just one adventure of a lifetime. I mean, you were and still are the first and youngest Egyptian to scale Everest, the highest point on the planet. You've completed the highest 7 summits in the world. You've done the Grand Slam. You've done both the North and the South Poles. And we've climbed quite a few mountains together. What was the toughest of them all?
I think, just to clarify, I was the youngest to climb Everest at the time. There's since been younger Arabs to do it. As I think climbing gained popularity in the region and it started to become more of a normal thing. You remember like the times when I was doing those things initially, like it was, you'd be considered like mad, to do it. And you were like ridiculed. And it's not like do your own thing or whatever. It's a guy doing his thing. It was like people were like offended like by it, and they had to make a point to tell me like why this was wrong, But I think you have to split it between like what was the most physically demanding and was most technically demanding.
And mentally.
Yeah. The mentally, I would say, so when it comes to the technicality, there's a lot of fear, because there's these very steep mountains, very technical mountains. You're using 2 ice axes and you're standing on the tips of on crampons, on the tips of your fingers. And so there's always the feeling of like, if I make a mistake, I slip, I fall. So there's that fear. And that's obviously very mentally taxing. When you do these big endurance climbs, not to say that Everest also doesn't have a lot of fear element, but the fear is sometimes can be very existential, because you know an avalanche can happen at any moment and could wipe out this entire camp, but you don't know when it could happen or what moment. But the mental part becomes like from just the sheer exhaustion and discomfort that you're enduring on a daily basis for weeks at a time. So I would say like some of the hardest climbs I've ever done were actually some of the least popular climbs that people don't know anything about. Were mainly in the Andes mountains in Peru, really steep mountains with like 500-600 meter like near vertical walls and stuff like that. That was, for me, that was the peak of my climbing from a skill standpoint. And then when I started aspiring to do Everest, I kind of transitioned into more of the endurance expedition style climbing. And so I remember, for example, one mountain in the Andes called Alpamayo, which is, interestingly, there was a mountain beauty pageant many, many years ago, and it was voted the most beautiful mountain on earth. And that was a very, very... that was a very challenging mountain, and there was one route called the French direct. That term is in climbing is referred to using the word direct. It's when you take the lowest of the starting point of a climb, and you take a ruler and you connect it with the summit, like a straight line that becomes like the most direct line to the summit, and usually is the most steep or the hardest way to get there. So that was called the French direct. And I would say Everest still is one of the hardest in terms of just the physicality of it, and you're 2 months on the mountain as well.
It's a 10-week expedition, I think.
Yeah, I would say like closer to 8 weeks. Yeah,
and I want to stay there. I want to stay at the pinnacle of the world, because the story of it for me is very on point and on brand with the concept of disrupting the norms and choosing what you want to do in life. Right before you climbed Everest, you were on a career path, London School of Economics, you had your MBA, you were heading into the private equity, you were well set in a world of finance and set up for a career. And then all of a sudden you said, you know what, this is maybe not what I want to do. And that's a challenge in its own. That's a pinnacle and a peak to climb in its own. How was that period for you? And what was going through your mind when you were making these choices?
So I started, I was one of those kids that had no clue what they wanted to do for a living. Like it's, people usually are surprised by that, because it looks like, if you look at my path, it looks like, this guy was very single-minded like the whole time. I graduated from school not really knowing what I wanted to study in university. I ended up going into engineering, Cairo University for a while, and then I switched to AUC, and then I wasn't really sure what I wanted to study then. I stumbled into economics because it was the most practical thing. What I really actually wanted to study was anthropology, but everybody, basically told me,
what is
can you name one job that you, and I couldn't. I didn't even know what an the subject matter really appealed to me, but looking at the universe in Egypt, I thought like, I don't know what an anthropologist would do. Of course, now I know, but and perversely, interestingly, actually, that everything that I've done since lends itself more to anthropology than it does to anything else. But I was very dissuaded from this, and then when I graduated from university, I didn't know what I wanted to do as a job, and so people were like, well, if you don't know what you want to do, there is this thing called investment banking that seems like everybody wants to try and get a job at. So I ended up falling into that, and so my first couple of years in my career were, there was a honeymoon period of the first 6 months when you're just excited about everything. I'm living in London. I'm away from my parents. I'm earning my own keep. You were earning a reasonably good salary for someone your age, so you can travel. You can do things. I could actually start climbing because the first climb I ever did was when I was 15 in Switzerland, and I came back actually wanting to climb Everest. That was the inspiration. But my parents were like, "There's no way we're going to pay money to put you at risk." And so I was just hiking and dreaming about it. But it was the moment when I was starting to earn my own salary and I was no longer financially dependent on my family that I was like, now I can make my own decisions. So the beauty of the career, even though that it wasn't right for me, is that it ushered this period where I had the financial means to do what I wanted. And immediately I started climbing and hiking and so on. But it was other than that, after the honeymoon period wore off, لا, I felt trapped. I felt like a prisoner, like in this thing. These types of banks and these types of corporates, I'm not trying to diss the industry, but it's just that I wasn't right for it. I mean, someone else could be sitting right next to me and this could be the perfect scenario. It felt like they're very good at getting you like so specialized so quickly. Then you start to think like, if I leave this, what else can I do? What am I trained to do?
Did you feel it was an easy choice for you to say, okay, regardless of what I've achieved in this field, what's good for me is to move on to something else? Was that an easy choice? Did it come easy, or was it a challenging thing?
No, it was really difficult. It was almost like coming up against everything that we were conditioned to do as young people in that generation. I mean, now it looks maybe quite different. I mean, now you can maybe struggle to get, like at the time I was, let's say 21, 22, you might struggle now to get a 21, 22-year-old to conform into a corporate kind of thing. At the time, it was the flip side, if you remember. And I know you were a person who charted an unorthodox path almost from the beginning. However, that wasn't the norm at all. And
started in med school, so I was on that same trajectory.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you broke free from that like earlier than most, right? And so for me, especially in London, there was always also the sense of guilt. Like, your parents have invested so much in you. You're fortunate enough, by God, to get this job that's paying you well, and now you want to leave it and throw it all away. So that was kind of weighing on me. And then I also didn't know what else am I good at. And I never had the chance to really explore like what I'm good at. And so I still remember to this day, my dad was flying into London and we were supposed to have dinner. And it was a big moment for me because that was the moment that I was going to invite him for dinner. It was like, it's a very much of a rite of passage as a boy becoming a man. I was very excited about it, but I was also very worried because there was a conversation that I wanted to have with him that was not going to be as exciting, which was that I was going to tell him that I was, considering, or actually had almost made the decision to quit my job and take a backpack and travel the world. And so I remember like having the dinner, we were like really nice dinner, and I waited till dessert. Because I thought
sweeten the deal.
Sweeten the deal, and if it went pear-shaped, I could just get the hell out of there really quick. I waited, and I was like, and it was one of those things where like the restaurant was already closing, like everybody else had left, that kind of thing. We were like, 15 minutes. He had to catch the last train, and that kind of thing. It was like having the conversation, and I was like, there's something I want to talk to you about. He's like, what is it? It's like, I think I'm gonna leave the bank. Initially, he took it pretty well. He was like, that's okay. Like, what other bank are you gonna join instead? I was like, it's not a bank really. And he's like, all right, good. Like, cool. Like, what company, what industry? And he's like, nah, I'm just gonna like take a backpack and travel the world. And it was one of those, like, his face was like the 404 out of
error not found.
Like, he initially didn't have a reaction because he was like, surely what he's saying is, I've misheard what he's saying, And then when it kind of dawned on him, we started having this like massive debate. He was like, there was a sense of pride, with our like family at the time. When their friends talk to them, it's like, oh, what does your son do? Oh, my son is a banker in London and stuff like that. That's it's also a testament that as a father he'd done his job well. And that's that kind of. It wasn't about, And I that was just how it was at the time. It wasn't like, I'm happy because my son is happy and he's
fulfilling his dreams,
doing what he loves. It's like he's meeting this kind of standard. And I had full marks in that. I was getting a salary that even surprised me at the time. I had like a imposter syndrome, like, why am I paying so much money for this? And I was working abroad. I was living independently and stuff. I scored very highly on all of these things, but as far as like anything to do with fulfillment, I was like, I was like صفر على الشمال, I was not doing anything. We had a big debate and we had to pay the bill and everything and walk back to the train station. Finally, we get on the platform and like we look at the thing and the train is like 4 minutes away. We're still having this debate and he's like trying to convince me out of it and he's not happy and this and that. And we realized that we have to conclude this conversation because it was not only that he was leaving that day, he was traveling the next morning. And in the end, he said, "Look, you know what? It's and I appreciated this." And he said, like, you know, it's your life, but it was kind of like it's your life to ruin, but it was still like your life. You can kind of choose to see it the way you want, Yani, and I chose to see it that way. Do whatever you want. So it was a some kind of veiled blessing, but at the same time, time will prove that I was right, and this is a wrong decision.
Thankfully, I would say, thankfully, he was sort of disproved a little bit.
Yeah. So I ended up, actually, it was funny because I ended up, it was so validating that I then quit my job, and then I ended up like actually shouldering a backpack and traveling for about 370 days across Asia and Latin America. And then when I came back because I actually was broke. I had like kind of, you know, I'd basically spent all the money that I had, and I came back to London, very expensive place. I was like, crap, I need a job, like, and I need it yesterday. And so I ended up applying back to the same bank and getting a job within a month. And the funny thing is that when I got the other job, I was promoted to an associate. So usually in banking, investment banking in those days, you're an analyst for 2 years and then you become an associate.
So you got fast tracked.
So basically everyone that had stayed that year slogging in the bank was an associate, and I came in. I had just spent a year on vacation and came back so I was like, that's just like super, validating that I actually did the right decision.
And when did the Everest decision come about?
The Everest decision came. So the decision to do Everest, it was planted. The seed was planted when I was 15 on that like trip to Switzerland. However, it was kind of in the back of my mind, and then life would basically, teach me like, sometimes would say like, this is too far fetched. You're never going to do this. Whatever. Just focus on the real stuff and all of that. So I would get sidetracked, and then sometimes I'd find a wave of inspiration, and then I'd be like, you know what, I need to. But it was always teetering. And because it's something that costs a lot of money and required a great deal of planning and intention, it's not something that you could just pull the trigger on. It was never really it was always there in the back of my mind, but it was never activated. And perversely, like when I finally quit the job the second time, I found myself, I had a few years of investment banking experience. I need to get another job. I didn't know what else I was good at. And so one of my best friends said, like, you need to retool. You need to go back to university and do an MBA. So it was a very tactical like decision. And so I applied and actually got accepted into London Business School, not School of Economics. They'd be very upset if they heard it was LSE. And I got in there, and the promise that I did to myself was, Omar, you're there for 2 years. Put the climbing on the side, the traveling on the side, get serious. Study, because if you study really well and get good grades, you're gonna get a good job, and then you can like get your career back on track. So I was still, having done the 370-day trip, I was still in the mindset that was like a thing that I wanted to get out of my system, and then eventually just get back to the straight and narrow. So I get into the MBA, and within 3 weeks, some guy announces, we weren't friends at the time still. He announces that like, I want to do this presentation about Everest, something like, if anyone's interested and stuff. So I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. I go in, it's a room full of like 50 people. He's there presenting, and he starts presenting that he has this idea that we will train. He wants to put together a team that will train together for those 2 years. And by the time we finish the MBA, we'll go on an expedition to climb Everest.
That's as serendipitous as it gets, really.
Yeah. And so I was sitting there like, just, like when you hear something or something is presented to you and you start feeling there's something firing up in your body. You can't deny it. It's like a sense of aliveness that's already been plugged, in. And that's the thing that I usually tell people, like, when they're like, should I follow this feeling? Should I do this, whatever? And it's like, always go back to the body. Even then I didn't have the awareness of thinking it in those terms. But thinking back, was exactly what it is. Like my body just felt alive. It's almost like someone turned on the ignition just by the mere thought or presentation of this potential reality, And so while I was sitting there, while he was talking, I'd already made up my mind. Crazy enough, I'd already had this plan that I'd outlined for months. And now in a split second, I was like, okay, now I'm going to also train for Everest while I'm doing this MBA, which is this super hard, demanding thing.
It was a 2-year process.
2-year process. So we trained. Of course, it took a toll a bit on my studies and my grades and stuff, but I think I did a good job. It was so touch and go that I was handing in my graduation project from base camp. I remember sitting there before we started like the actual climb proper, sitting there like tinkering with the satellite modem, trying to send the email. I have to admit, I did kind of like stitch up my team a bit, like my group. It was a group, and I think they probably did a bit more work than I did. I had the perfect excuse. But yeah, like I ended up graduating and stuff, and we did Everest.
And that process, that 2-year process and leading up to the mountain is, for me, will take another podcast episode on its own. But I want to sort of fast track that process up until summit day and the moment of summiting. Going through your mind, what was going through your mind as you were literally about to step on the highest point on the planet? And what was it like on top of Everest?
So I think if just to break it down, obviously it's to get to the top of Everest, it's like 4 camps. So the last day, I'm 12 kilos like under what I you're physically, mentally exhausted. But surprisingly, and maybe it was because I built it up so much in my head, the summit day was much easier than I thought. The day before was brutal, but the summit day was, maybe I expected it to be way harder than it actually was, and maybe I was just in a good space. But there was still a huge uncertainty. Everest is at 8,850 meters. At 8,800 meters, roughly, there's the Hillary Step, which is a famous kind of objective kind of obstacle named after Sir Edmund Hillary.
Yes, not Hillary Clinton, no.
Yeah, not Hillary Clinton. And so, but it also acts as a bottleneck, because there's only one person at a time that can climb the Hillary Step, because it's quite narrow. So if you have a lot of climbers or a few climbers, they all have to wait up and down until one goes at a time. So sometimes it can cause a lot of time, and that allows for weather to change. And if the weather changes very quickly, there's a lot of people who have abandoned their climbs at that point. So if you're 50 meters away from the summit after spending 2 months on the mountain, that's heartbreaking. So I started to feel really good on the day, and I felt at some point I was like, because remember, I was the first Egyptian to attempt it. Obviously I knew people had climbed Everest, but I always had this idea, I'm Egyptian, we're not built for this kind of stuff. I don't know how fit or how capable you need to be to actually make it. There was no reference point for me. So I always had the doubt. But at a certain point on the summit day, I was like, I can do this. Physically, I know I can do it. But then I was like, it doesn't totally matter, because if the weather thinks otherwise that day, no matter if you're Hercules, it's not going to happen. So it was only until I crossed the Hillary Step and then climbed up the last part of the ridge that I could see finally the summit. And I knew it was the summit because, I've seen the pictures. There's all these Tibetan prayer flags. And it was like a very emotional few steps. Of course, there you take a step and then you take a few breaths and a step. So it's kind of everything's happening in slow motion. It's almost like your entire life and journey of the Everest is like flashing before your eyes. And you're way above the clouds. It feels almost like you can see the entire world, like you're looking beyond the horizon almost. And
you spend 8 to 10 weeks getting up there to
Yeah.
spend how much time on top of the mountain?
We were supposed to spend maybe 10, 15 minutes, and we ended up spending about an hour. There's a lot of what happened at the summit that I remember now, but I wasn't completely conscious of. I remember there was a good friend of mine, brilliant climber, that was like an idol when I was growing up. His name is Victor Saunders. Maybe he's, I think, a couple of decades like my senior, but like I grew up like reading books of his expeditions in the Karakoram and Himalayas. And he was with us on that day. He was leading another group. And I remember seeing him on the summit. It was such an amazing moment to share that summit day with a guy who was essentially like a hero of mine. And I think he told me something like, how do you feel? Or like, he looked at me and we congratulated each other. And I told him something I didn't remember. And he reminded me like days later. I said 5,000 years of civilization, and I'm still the first person to get here. And it's funny because they tell you that with altitude, the first thing that goes is your most complicated cognitive function, which is your sense of humor. So it was funny for me to realize that I still had a bit of that when I was up there, even though I couldn't remember it. Yeah, and we ended up staying about an hour, which is too much, until I realized I'd been up here for too long, and then then you realize that you're only halfway, and then you have to take the long journey down.
Wow. Mountains. I want to stay on the mountains a little bit because for one, I feel like I've learned a lot about myself through climbing mountains. And you've certainly climbed a whole lot more mountains physically and proverbially speaking. What have the mountains taught you?
I think it's taught me a lot about humility. It's taught me a lot about appreciating the simple things in life, just because your existence up there can be very rugged and difficult. I think it's triggered some like spiritual kind of insights around like how small we are, like in this vast kind of world, and it's about how we can live and enact greatness in our own life, but at the same time realizing how insignificant we are. So it's this duality of, it's like you can be somebody who has like deep humility, but don't love yourself enough, or you don't give yourself enough space and regard, and so that could be a crutch. You could also be somebody who thinks so highly on themselves, has no humility, and that's a double crutch. But it's about balancing this thing, realizing on one hand that you are so fragile, that you're so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but also at the same time recognizing your own greatness, your own brilliance within your own life, and not like towards other people or something, but just if you can balance those two things together, I think it's a very beautiful combination.
It's very powerful, man. I resonate a lot with that. And what I resonated most with when we did our first climb together was, and we'll talk about that right now, climbing Kilimanjaro. You never conquer a mountain. Mountains aren't conquered. You're either allowed safe passage or you're allowed to experience something else. So I want to touch up on that climb, 2010. It was Egypt's first ever charity climb, group charity climb, climbing the highest point in Africa, Mount Kilimanjaro. And I think, if I remember correctly, there was 27 of us.
Yeah.
How was that trip for you? And how did it feel knowing that that is the trip where you met Marwa, you met your wife? And I also want to touch up on the difference between Omar's state of mind climbing solo and the responsibility of being in charge of 27 other humans with you on that journey. And of course, I want to mention that was the first charity climb, and we were doing it for the Right to Live Association, which I'd also like to touch up a little bit on.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because in some sense that was my most significant climb of my life, because that's how, I mean, obviously knew Marwa from just a few weeks before, like in the lead up to the climb, but that's where, like, you develop these very strong bonds on the mountain. And so that was like an amazing kind of experience that we lived together, that I think contributed to us essentially becoming a couple and getting married and so on. It was also very dear to me because, like you said, the Right to Live Association is now 30, maybe 5 years old. It's an organization that my mother started. My two sisters, my two late sisters, they were special needs, and they were born at a time when there wasn't much awareness in Egypt about special needs. You could argue there still isn't enough awareness. And my mother obviously had two girls that had the same, were in the same situation, 5 years apart. Initially, she had to travel to the UK to put them in a school that could take care of them. And then she got to a point where she decided that she's going to go back to Egypt and do something about it. And, she was very young, very inexperienced, but she just purely out of passion and a sense of mission, she ended up starting this organization with a friend. and they still exist until this day. And so for me, this climb was, also a moment of becoming as the son, to give something back to this organization, to give something back to my sisters, because obviously my sisters went to school there. And so it meant a lot to me to be able to do that for them, to do that for my mom in some way. And then, of course, the fact that we had like a whole spectrum of people on this group, from people who were relatively experienced hikers, for example, like yourself, to people who had never set foot on a mountain before, to people who were like in great shape, to some people who are maybe a little bit out of shape, and everything in between. And for that group to then prepare together, because the preparation wasn't just the physical stuff that people went through, but it was also like a lot of group activities and just really bonding together as a team before we went to Tanzania.
It was understanding a lot of stuff. What are gaiters? Why do I need sticks to hike with? I can walk.
Yeah.
So there was so much prep that went into it.
Yeah, and then obviously no one had, I think, been to that altitude. So even though Kilimanjaro, let's say if you look at the 7 summits, it might not rank as one of the hardest. However, it is one of the highest.
And being in altitude, you will never understand what it is until you actually experience it and how it can affect different people in different ways.
So that was a different experience for me, because it's not like Everest, for example. Like I didn't have a doubt necessarily that I wouldn't be able to make it, unless, of course, you could get sick or something. But I didn't have any doubts of that kind. However, my entire focus was focused on the responsibility of getting these people up there and back down safely. And obviously, the focus is more on getting back down safely. And of course, everyone had put in so much effort, because everybody had to fundraise through their own network and their own pocket to participate and earn their spot.
And the main sponsor had put up a promise that whatever you raised for funds, if you make it to the summit, they would match it.
Yeah, that was.
So you weren't just climbing for yourself;
yeah.
You felt like you were climbing for others as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody, it was 100% success rate, and it was mind blowing. I remember it was so emotional for me on the summit. I always get emotional on Kili because I'd been a few times, and there's a moment that near Stella Point, when the sun's starting to rise, I always get very emotional. It always stirs something inside of me. But I think I was like, doubly emotional that day, because there were certain people that I really had my doubts on that summit day that that they would make it. And the fact that they, I remember, like, because I would like climb fast and be with the first group, and then I would lag behind and be with the bottom group, and then sometimes I would go, like I would be in the front, and then I would go back down, and we were trying to keep everyone together, and we were like singing through the night and keeping the energy up. I would go down, and a part of me would be like, when I get back down, some people won't be there. They would have just already made a decision and I would go back down, and then I would see someone still there, and I would like get emotional, like, because I would see like, it might not be difficult for me at that point, because I'd already done Everest the year before, or a couple of years before, so I was in a different physicality and shape. But I knew that this was still an Everest for them, and the fact that they are like still pushing through it, and because we were doing all of this for a cause, it was amazing. It was an amazing.
It was
time.
very inspirational, because that last summit night on Kilimanjaro, according to almost everyone that was there, it was 100% a mental fight. It didn't matter how fit you were. We had special forces guys with us that were physically struggling, and it was just
they were Gurkhas.
Yeah. It was purely a mental fight, and there was even, I think there was 1 or 2 people, they were still attempting to make it up as we were on our way back down, and most of us had probably written them off. So I can resonate and relate to how emotional it got, knowing that someone overcame their own mental walls in that way. It was such an experience.
But if you remember, and I think I'm correct in saying this, because there's the famous photo that made it to the cover of Community Times magazine at the time, and I think we're, if I'm not mistaken, I think we're all in that picture.
I think we were -1.
Maybe -1.
We were -1.
Yeah. But yeah, like for the most part, and then eventually I think we had to get people down, because we'd been up there for a while, like taking pictures and like doing all kinds of different things on the top.
Touch of altitude sickness.
Yeah.
So again, I know it might get a bit emotional, but Marwa, meeting Marwa and bonding. We all bonded on that mountain, but clearly you developed a special bond. And then that was the time where you, khalas, you started up Egypt's, and I think the Arab world's first adventure travel company that was focused on carbon neutral travel, Wild Guanabana. Tell us a bit more about the story and how it moved on.
Yeah, I mean, WG was the first, I guess, hiking climbing company. There was adventure companies in Egypt at the time, like we all know, like Dabuka and Khasset, and focusing on long desert expeditions with like 4x4 cars and so on. But this was journeys on foot, and the idea was that because when you're traveling on foot, you're traveling slow. It's a much more mindful type of experience, and it's much more connected to the nature and surroundings. I think probably even my brother, I think, bonded more with Marwa during the trip because obviously when you're the leader of the group, your time has to be divided across like so many people. There was a seed of this strength, and I already felt like I feel something different about this person. When we came back, that's when we the relationship and the everything really flourished, and it moved very quickly. And I still remember, being at that time, I think it's 2010, so I would have been like 32 years old or something like that. And I think at that time you're like very kind of afraid of like commitment, and you're very hesitant. And I think the beauty of my relationship with Marwa is that it's either that she sensed that from the get-go, or she was just in a different mindset, but she just kind of let me for my own like I never felt an ounce of like pressure, or if I needed to frame the relationship in a certain way. We were just kind of getting to know each other like gradually, and because I had that space, unknowns to her at the time, because I think I found out later that when her parents would tell her like, so what's going on with this, is it serious, is it going to be something, whatever, she was just like, I don't know, don't ask me about it, that kind of thing. However, I was like, with this kind of space and freedom, I was already feeling like more and more attached, and I started making a decision like, okay, this is the person I want to spend, at the time I thought would be like the rest of my life with. And so it was I think it was August 2010 that we did Kili, right?
Yeah.
And I ended up proposing to Marwa on April 4th in Amsterdam. She was supposed to go and meet her. She had an annual trip where she would meet her siblings, and I ended up surprising her there and like proposing. And then I had another surprise for her, because I also told her like, if you're up for it, we'll also get married on May 5th, which is unheard of, especially in Egypt. That you're gonna get essentially engaged, or promised to marry, and then a month and a day later you actually have to have the actual wedding. And so subhanallah, like everything flowed super smooth, and that's like a great sign, that you're doing the right thing. Like it's like, imagine, especially like from a girl's perspective, imagine like planning a wedding, the wedding dress, like inviting the people, like securing the hall, doing the everything in less than a month, actually, because by the time we got back from Amsterdam, it was already like 20 something days.
Some would say probably more difficult than scaling Everest.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see, yeah, it was when it was an incredible night. It was like, so and everything. I mean, my relationship with Marwa and my life with her, everything just was, everything just went on fast forward. It was almost like on a soul level, like we knew that in this life we have very limited time, and we just need to make the most out of it. And so of course, like when it surprisingly like came to an end after Tila was born, it was like crushing.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to touch up on that incident, that being abroad. You weren't even in Egypt. You were in Miami at the time, in the States, and you were alone all of a sudden with your newborn daughter. The feelings, the mental strength that got you throughout that phase. Tell us a bit about that.
I mean, I can tell you, like, I didn't feel like strong at all, like at the time. Yani. It was just after I'd finished the 7 summits. So I actually went from Alaska, which is where the last climb was, straight to Miami.
Denali, it was Mount Denali.
Yeah. And it was a very joyous time, because I just finished. I was the first Egyptian to do it. I had so many other plans of things I wanted to do, both from an adventure perspective, but also for our life together. We'd been married for a while, so we had moved to Dubai. The company had started a branch there. We had just signed the lease on a new, bigger apartment in expectation of having the baby. We had just done a housewarming in that same apartment before we left to the States. So we moved in, moved our stuff, had a housewarming with all of our friends. It was very happy kind of day. Packed our stuff with the anticipation that we're going to come back and start the rest of our life. So actually one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life is go back to this apartment and pack it. And, I'm very fortunate to have had my brother with me in those 3-4 days. And it must have been like some of the hardest days of my life. But when I got back from Denali, initially everything was fine. And then very quickly, like, things turned, and it was, because it was a complication that, no one had spotted, no one knew anything about. And Marwa was very healthy. And so, yeah, I mean, Tila was born and Marwa passed away like 4 or 5 days later. And I couldn't really tell you like what I was feeling at the time. I just felt like a empty shell, and the tears just wouldn't stop, like, and that was like for months. I remember saying, like, someone asked me, and I said that, like, I remember I would, like, sometimes, like, in my room alone, I would sometimes just scream just to drown the voices, like, in my head. It took me a while to even start to be even just like okay enough to just conduct myself normally in life. But remember, I still had a business that was my only livelihood. Now I had a daughter that I had to also, like, kind of support. Marwa was like, once we got married, she joined the company and she was essentially like the driving force of it. So when she passed away, not only that I felt like I'd lost everything, in practical terms even, I wasn't able to go to work, to do anything, and it was felt like legit, like my entire life was just crumbling around me. Even the people we had a very small team back then, but everybody was like, what Marwa was like, everybody adored her, like, and so just everybody was crushed. No one could do anything. And it was actually Marwa Fayeed's toy run. It was called Cairo Toy Run, I think. That it was an initiative that Marwa had started, where she was collecting used and unwanted toys from, like, friends and family, and, like, going to, like, an orphanage and, like, donating them and staying with the kids and playing with them and stuff. And I just stumbled upon that, and she had spoken about it before. And I decided, like, let me just revive it, for Taha. It was in August, and it was Ramadan, and I was like, for Little Adra, I'm gonna do a toy drive and stuff. And I had like a very humble goal of how many toys to collect, but then, like, toys just start coming in from everywhere, even, like, being shipped from abroad. And that was basically the seed for then saying, like, well, maybe instead of just an initiative, maybe this could become a charity. You know how difficult it is to even start a charity in Egypt, let alone, like, run it and everything. But that was at a time when I would go to work and I couldn't get 10 minutes of work done. When the toy run idea, and I decided to call it Marwa Fayeed's Toy Run, all of a sudden I could put in 10 hours a day, because I was doing it for her. I was doing it for something bigger than myself. And once, by the end of that year, by the end of 2013, a couple of notable things happened. One was obviously that the charity itself was doing really well. We won Humanitarian Project of the Year. It was like an NBC award, and it was crazy to get recognized like that from something. But that didn't give us the impetus. We had collected a lot of toys, thousands, to maybe registered as a charity. That process took months to complete, but it had started then. But also, if you remember, in 2013, that was the time when I was, during Marwa's time when she was still alive, I was in the running to go to space.
The Axe Apollo campaign.
Yeah.
Yes. You were going to be the first Egyptian in space as well.
So she, when she passed away, this was still in the process. In the end of 2013, in December, I remember going to compete in the finals with like 108 or something people from all over the world. Just this kind of broken man with just still this dream. And for me, it was this idea that like this dream was born and I lived it with Marwa. So I wanted to do it also like for her and of course for myself. And I ended up winning that competition and so on. So it was kind of a bittersweet kind of ending to the year. Like the charity had now become like a thing. It was no longer just an idea or an initiative. It was an actual physical thing. And now it seemed at the time that like that dream of space would actually happen. And I was able to go back to work and try to resuscitate the company and so on. And yeah, so and of course, Yani, I just not necessarily go in detail about this, but it was also challenging for me because I was not able to raise my daughter. I had my goal and what I wanted to do was I was a single dad, but I wanted to have that privilege. I wanted to have that right to raise her. But because of my in-laws' wishes at the time, and because of also the way the legalities and laws work, I couldn't. Obviously I still a big part of her life, but it was more like I would visit her and so on. And so that also was a huge toll. It felt that I had lost essentially the two most important people in my life. So that was a very difficult time, and it was for some years until I was able to slowly build myself back up.
But we fast forward to now, and you mentioned sweetness. So we fast forward now to a sweet teen Tila, who I would be quick to say is more of a friend of mine than she is my friend's daughter.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, I mean, I'm sure it's not easy, being a single dad, but the process and the mental dialogue that you had with yourself in order to ensure and to be sure that she will come out to be the beautiful young lady, intelligent, outspoken, expressive, artistic lady that she is today.
Yeah. Pre-teen still, alhamdulillah, 12, but
almost there.
But getting into the tough years. But yeah, Yani, because you guys did the performance together this year, so you got a chance to get to know her even better than you did, and like she's really a blessing. Like she's she's
an interesting human.
Yeah,
she's a very interesting human being.
Yeah.
So your thought process, your mental dialogue, what you would constantly say to yourself as a single father, because I don't think a lot of people talk about, especially in our culture, people don't talk about the struggles of a single dad, or how a single dad should think or act, or tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, there aren't that many. I mean, there is, of course, quite a few, but and even I remember when during the time before Tila started living with me when she turned 7. Even before that, I remember I would sit with like older men, wiser men, they would not necessarily I wasn't asking for their advice, but how older men like to impart advice. I guess now I'm the older man, but I'm trying not to be the guy who's unsolicited advice to younger guys. They were like, why are you doing? You're in the perfect situation. You can you live your own life. You can choose how little or how much to spend with your daughter. You just need to support her financially. And I'm like, okay, cool, but I didn't really ask for your advice, and especially if that's how you're approaching it, definitely we're very in a different thing. So unfortunately, there is a
Bit of a stigma around it,
there's you don't
or
see
lack
it,
of awareness.
you don't see it often that that a man will choose to be in a situation where they are of course in a my situation is also, as somebody who's a bereaved kind of situation, a widow, like that's also less common. So in that situation, um, the law basically says that the custody goes to the mother of the mother, and so in most cases, a man will say, okay, right, and I'll play within that realm. It's much rare that they would say, no, I mean, you try to work hard to change the situation and for me to raise my own daughter. Because obviously, in a situation where there's a divorce, for example, rightfully so, the law is such that the woman, if she is fit and willing and able, then takes the custody. So it was like a difficult time. Now it's one of like my greatest pleasures in life. Of course, it means that my lifestyle changes quite a bit. I have to think twice about doing this trip or that trip, or going off and doing this or that. And of course, for someone like me, where freedom and open spaces and stuff is a huge value, it does present a challenge. But that's okay. That's a challenge that I welcome. And it's my move to the Red Sea, to Soma Bay, has allowed me this kind of slower life. That's really allowed me to spend more time with Tila, to step into that more, away from the hustle of Cairo, and where you're constantly going from one thing to the other and you're not very present. So I enjoy that.
It sounds like your approaches to life have changed, be it approaches to entrepreneurship or adventures or parenting even. And I caught a post of yours recently where you said something along the lines of, wait a minute, maybe the mistake is not something that you should fear. The mistake, maybe it should be the arrow that should guide you.
The fear is the arrow that points you in the right direction.
Which actually made me curious. So be it entrepreneurship, be it parenting, be it changing perspectives, I'm always curious, and we're always curious in EMIT Talks about your internal dialogue, what the things you tell yourself, So I'm sure a lot of people would be curious, having been through so much success, but also through so much adversity. What's Omar Samra's inner dialogue like? What's your own pep talk like?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I think in my 20s, that's the Everest days. It was very much push through, overcome challenges, live completely out of your comfort zone. It's this kind of very alpha kind of mindset. And then, of course, at the time, I was also trying to build my career as well. And then in the 30s, it became just a kind of a continuation of that, trying to build a legacy, almost trying to almost building a stack of achievements, adventures that I could be something that for me that was I could be proud that I did all of these things. And then obviously from a career perspective, also trying to get to a place where in my companies, I think there was a lot, especially in my early 30s, there was a mindset of trying to build a bigger company, to expand more geographically, to do this and that and the other. I remember opening a bunch of different businesses. And now in my 40s, it's kind of switched quite a bit. And now I'm also in the mid to tail end of the 40s. It's I'm actually spending more time thinking about decluttering, closing things off that don't necessarily sit right there square in what I want to do. So I'm starting to apply, I guess, a different filter. And I think the ego does die down a little bit, or it's still there, but it's kind of its voice is sort of it's a bit further away, and it's easier just kind of not to turn your back to it, while taking the things that it's also good things about that part of it. And you start to prioritize like peace of mind. You start to prioritize like your own well-being. Like, what is the good of like working your ass off and hustling on something when ultimately like you're not enjoying the thing. The process itself is not enjoyable to you, and you're doing it because you want to get to that place. But we all know that it's just, so you go through all of this like discomfort and like not such a good thing to get to that thing. But actually once you get to it, it's actually very fleeting, and just for a moment you're like, oh, I got it, and then it just, you realize like actually it doesn't really hold any value. And so it's it's that old kind of anecdote of the fisherman, right? So you start to kind of feel like that anymore. That more and more you start to feel like that. And I think for me, the one way of I looked at it was it's almost like my early years, all the way into like even my late 30s, early 40s, was like my warrior days. And as a warrior, you believe that you are fighting like it's like you're playing a finite game in an infinite universe. It doesn't match. So you, it's almost like you see the world as just a whole bunch of dragons, continuously bigger and bigger dragons that you have to slay to keep going forward. And then you get to a point and you're like, wait a minute, there's like a whole bunch of other dragons waiting in the queue. They're just endless. So either I want to just keep fighting my life, just continue fighting these dragons. That's the infinite part. Or you kind of, so that's like a warrior archetype. Or then you step into, I want to say like the artist archetype, which, so the warrior is very much about doing to get through. And then the artist realizes that it's actually, I'm playing an infinite game in an infinite universe, and it's mostly about just being. So it's all about like this. So the thing that I'm trying to preserve and value and stuff is the state that I'm in. So everything that I'm going to do and how I'm going to organize my life is about preserving that state of being, which that state is, whether it's peace, it's, and you're not even looking for happiness because that's fleeting. But peace could be something that even in hard times and difficult times, because one of the things that I realized looking back is that even when I was at my biggest grief stage, something deep down inside of me always knew that everything is going to be okay, but I couldn't just tap it at that moment. So the peace is something that is really attainable. And so when you're in this kind of artist mindset, for me now, I start to gravitate more towards, more creative pursuits. So you'll have seen me more like writing more like these days.
Yes, you're on Substack now.
Yeah.
When's the book coming out?
That's something I'm working on. So the book is something that it's been in the making for a long time, but now I start to feel like now it's the time for it to be birthed. Getting more involved in like film projects. Even when I'm approaching trips and journeys and so on, I stopped doing so much of the journeys that like you and I went on together, which is like, we're going to summit this mountain or like chart this path or whatever, but more about, outdoor adventure experiences that also have an element of like spirituality and personal development as well in them. Like I was in Mongolia last summer with a group of people, and that was a very different kind of trip, but it reignited my excitement about this type of experience because and it's kind of now about, I'm actually content with of course I will still experience things in life, but I'm actually content with the amount of experiences and journeys and tribulations and trials that I've went through. And now it's the giving back time. Now it's about like really coming to terms with what is it that I've learned, like integrating these things, and how can I communicate these things? How can I, how can it
reach out to more people?
Yeah,
to affect more.
And it starts with Tila. And in order for me to impart some of that like, let's say like
learned lesson
or different life that I've led, you need to be like present. Right? So it's not so much about her seeing me like out there gallivanting, doing all of these things. Maybe she'll see a bit of that, but it's about, this is somebody who did all of these things evidently throughout his life, but he presents himself now as this very present, grounded kind of person who's feels at ease with this phase of his life that he's in, where he doesn't need to prove necessarily something. And it just becomes more about whatever you're doing, just do it with presence, just do it with like value in mind. And that's it, And I think it's something that we, to an extent, we all start to feel when we're in this phase, but it's about our resistance to it. And the more we surrender to it, then the more like we can faster usher this phase of life into existence.
Speaking of ushering this phase of life into existence and success, we began with failure, and so naturally we end with success. Omar, you've been very successful in so many endeavors in your life, from scaling mountains to opening companies to being such an amazing father. What is success in your mind? How would you translate it into words?
It's a really good question. I think success to me equals authenticity. The more authentic you are with yourself, and it's also a beautiful thing is that it's a measure that only you can answer for yourself, because you can put whatever facade out into the world. People can think you're successful. That's easy. Comes easier to people than others. But the true measure of success is like how closely does your what you say and your actions and belief how closely does your actions and what you say track your beliefs. And the closer these things are aligned, the more truly successful you are. That might translate into financial success, might translate into fame, might translate into whatever, and it might not. But that basically will be the cards that you were dealt in this life. You could be somebody who becomes very rich, and so in the view of everyone, you are successful. But ultimately, deep down within yourself, you will know that you haven't been successful because you have abandoned yourself along the way. And perversely, you could be, you could have like not be blessed with the material gains or those types of things that people believe they're successful. But you deep down know that you are. But then your journey, you have to come to terms with the fact that like, I don't need to be successful in your eyes and your eyes and your eyes for me to feel validated. And I just have to be myself, my unique self, which is again goes back to just being authentic. So it's the simplest thing you can do, because all you have to do is just be you. But it's also the hardest thing as well, and especially like in this world that we live in, that is consistently asking more of you, that is asking you to do things more, to do it faster, and of course it's getting harder with social media and the advent of AI and everything else.
Well, you know what? That's as inspiring as it gets, Mr. Omar Samra. May you always find your authentic self. May you always be closely aligned, and may you always succeed and achieve more and more. Thank you so much for joining us on EMIT Talks. We hope you enjoyed it. And I think we'll probably have another episode, hopefully very soon, because there's still so much to talk about with you.
Habibi, it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure, man. Thank you.